Okay, audio checks out. I burped and it came right on through. On the way up, it did a glitch, and the glitch was no good. It was no good. It sounded like you were in the belly of the omega-13. I didn't eat it. Yeah, I got to tear the top of it off because I can't lift it up high enough while also staying on the street. Also, I'm going 5 over, which is also known as 10 over. Here's the thing. Are you ready? This is the topic. Right and left hemisphere reintegration, okay? It's been the fixation lately. It's been the thing that I've had on my mind, all right? And that you have on your mind, and all humans have on their minds since the beginning of humankind, and it's had a massive effect on everything, reintegration. So, there's a prime example of how both insight into the nature of things is wildly helpful, and why one ought get wisdom as the principal thing, but secondarily, it is also quintessentially indicative of the priority of obedience, for we do not know what we do not know, and a listening heart will prep us to hear what we have not yet heard, so that we don't live in folly. So, reintegration. A lack of education. Not really, no, that's just Fox and Hound. Reintegration. So reintegration is basically this. You are taking in way more information right now than you can possibly sort. You are. Look at all of it. People and things and green and sky. Like, do I have to give you an example? Sadly, sometimes you do, because you're like, what are you talking about? There's not more than I'm aware of. Yeah, there's more than you're aware of. And neurologically speaking, even there's still like more than you are even receiving. Wow, that's a really cool thought to think about. That's an important thought. But the place in which you receive information. But let's just stick with the simple reintegration. Okay, so you got your right hemisphere, and it is with primacy above all else, receiving all of the little feeds from all your little sensors and beyond. And it is taking it as this massive amount of scattered, ambiguous information, and it's observing it, and it's creating convictions on reality as it observes it, which is another way of saying it's looking at how things operate, and it's observing the natures inside and the integrations inside of those natures, and it's creating almost like a musical rhythmic understanding on how it's interacting, and then it feeds those hows that it is now considered from that large amount of information over to your left hemisphere through the corpus callosum, and your left hemisphere is able to say, either able to listen or say no. So your right hemisphere is sending stuff over, and your left hemisphere is going, no, this, no, this, no, this, and that's how that works. And then it takes the stuff that it took through and it processes it. And it goes, okay, because the clouds are gray and the weather got a little colder, it's probably going to rain, which means we need to build a tent. And then it takes that information and it gives it back over to the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere goes, oh my goodness, I have access to many shelters and many a raw material. I think I may just fashion a shelter from my overcoat using my belt as a ridgeline. Not exactly. It would just basically send back the ambiguous resource and the qualities of those different things. And then your left hemisphere, because it's already primed inside of that flow, will be not saying no as much because you're already kind of synchronized on a topic, and it'll be like, got it. This is how it goes. I remember this knot. Here's a taut line hitch. Here's a bowline. You can tie that with that. This could go to that tree, to that tree, to that tree. That one's strong enough. You remember that it's strong enough because your right hemisphere just is now telling me about the tenacity of living trees and when their little straws inside are still wet and alive, they can take more weight, which means I can use a little tree like this where that's not dead, that's not dry inside, and then there's this fantastic flow between great ambiguous amounts of information and very specific analytical specific approaches and task-oriented features, like such as something so specific as how to tie a specific knot. And you have this back and forth that goes. It's awesome. So what I've just done is I've described to a degree the exchange of observation, integration, and then reintegration, and or rather experience, integration, reintegration. And so that's oversimplified, but it's at least you could trace what's happening. And what's so cool about this is that when you have like a trauma response, when you have like literally trauma or fear or like survival based this and that, or a breakdown in trust, or like over self-reliance, or an over emphasis on your own independence and your need to survive and overcome everything, to the point where you no longer want to exist inside of reality. You want to create a reality where you understand all of the variables and only live inside of that, and you actually are okay with deleting real scenarios inside of that to overemphasize your ability to keep yourself stable inside of a purely erratic environment, as far as what, at least what your little left hemisphere would consider purely erratic. But the funny thing is that your right hemisphere goes, it's not erratic. Look at all these patterns. And your left hemisphere goes, I can't see any of that stuff. And that's literally what happens. Your left hemisphere can't. It doesn't know what it doesn't know. It literally is downline of your right hemisphere. It has less information. It has an oversimplification of the reality, but it did that so that way it could refine and process a specific little deterministic-ish, still probabilistic at heart nugget and send it back over. And the idea is that you're creating holistic wisdom all the way down to the reality, to the approach, and then back to the reality. And then you go back and forth, and that becomes a flow state. It's what Olympians call the voice. And they say if you don't follow the voice, you'll crash, which means that if you interrupt the process of integration, reintegration, you are going to hyperfixate on one quality, and you're no longer going to be entered into with the actual flow of reality, and you are no longer going to be able to operate with the prowess that an Olympian must, with the presence that an Olympian must, in order to ski, in order to snowboard, in order to hurl through the air and then catch the rings. You are not focusing on one small piece of information that is static in time. You are experiencing a reality that is presently moving as you yourself are moving within it, and you are operating with this large array of information far beyond what can be reduced down to one specific focal point. It is more ambiguous, but you are more integrated, you are alive, you are present. Flow state. It's awesome. And so this is how our brains can function. But when you have like a trauma, which is what I'm going to talk about, is because this is what I'm learning, is that my little left hemisphere lost some trust. You're okay, honey. I'm just in front of you because I'm going faster than you, and I was going faster than you. Me emerged close to you. I'm sorry, but it's because that person wanted to go. Here I go back. Fine, you can close the gap again. That's fine. Whatever, buddy. You're changing your speed now, which is a false precedent. Okay. And so what takes place is that I get some information from my right hemisphere into my left hemisphere, and then my left hemisphere doesn't want to give it back. It doesn't want to give it back. Isn't that silly? It tries to hope to be obsessive compulsive and stare at all the details. and not come back to the present. It's scared. It doesn't trust. It doesn't trust the process of something going outside of its view. And so it tries to keep everything inside of its own understanding. It's literally Proverbs 3:5-6, even down to the language of bînâ and yāḍaʿ. It's the exact same thing. It's deterministic versus probabilistic. It's sight, faith. It's left hemisphere dominance versus right hemisphere primacy. And it's this phenomenal situation where we're invited to actually allow the great, massive weight of our right hemisphere to rest on the trusting, on the faithfulness of God. So that way we don't lean on our own understanding and get locked inside of this deterministic prison, which it is a prison. And then we can acknowledge Him in all of our ways. But that word acknowledge is the word yāḍaʿ, which is the word know experientially. So you could literally say, know Him in all of your ways. Immediately empathize with who He is, where you are. And it's just so cool. But this is what I've been realizing as I've been dealing with some anxiety. I'm realizing my anxiety is a process of lordship, and lordship is a process of reintegration. My right hemisphere just gave my left hemisphere something, and my left hemisphere said it's in charge, and so it's not giving it back. But that's a problem with lordship, because it needs to let my heart, my right hemisphere, rest on the trust of the Lord, the trustworthiness, the faithfulness of the Lord. And so it needs to give it back. It needs to give it back. It needs to surrender lordship back to the King. I mean, this is such an eternal process of what a human being is actually even doing inside of reality, and what all human beings are doing inside of reality. And it's the reason why, if we don't have a relationship or a trust with our existence, we have an idol that is a deterministic idol, which is an oversimplification. And a lot of times it's just a rattle in the hand of our left hemisphere baby, so that way it doesn't throw a tantrum. Because we don't realize that the right hemisphere is the parent, even though it's nursing the left hemisphere, even though the left hemisphere often abuses it. It's this ridiculous back and forth. But yeah, this is what I've been learning. Anxiety, issue with lordship. Lordship looks like my right hemisphere gave my left hemisphere information to process, and it processed it, but then it didn't want to give it back. It wanted to keep the focus and figuring out the puzzle from that position. This happens with ChatGPT. He doesn't want to re-reference the internet. He wants to work off of what you've already spoken, and it becomes inaccurate really fast when it becomes disconnected from the pool of existential insight, where now it becomes an oversimplification that is incapable of being extrapolated and still connected to truth. Like expanding a JPEG that was already reduced from reality beyond its actual size, it just becomes pixels. And you can't infer what was in somebody's what somebody's name tag said when it's just pixels. It's just blah blah blah. You might be able to try to, use those blah blah blahs to trigger the memories and the reintegration process again, and it might be able to pull up, oh, these little blobs with that long blob reminds me that their name is Bob Long Blob. But anyway, like, you could do that, but you still require your right hemisphere in order to be able to do it. And so what this whole thing with reintegration looks like is like, I feel anxious, but then my heart is in this position of parenting my soul. My right hemisphere is in this position of parenting my left hemisphere inside of the greater wealth of existential orientation that the right hemisphere has, with its more accurate awareness of reality, as opposed to the oversimplification of reality, whether or not it's accurate. It's always oversimplified, that the left hemisphere has. And so I'm walking around the store feeling a little anxious, as one does often, overthinking what decisions they're making. For instance, I needed to buy a very expensive bear bag, but I'm realizing that the food that I'm eating is important, and having food is important, and having food when you're way out and away is really important, which all of a sudden elevates the practicality of having this bear bag, as well as having the critter proofness of it as well. And so it becomes just like a very simple investment to say, I will buy the $30 more one, so that way mice won't eat it, if that could actually be a legitimate issue, and it'll cause me to use that more often. But that information isn't really as so quickly readily available when I'm just working off of the oversimplification of the initial information that I had. And so this is what it looks like. Walking around, feeling a little bit anxious about my decision, or my maybe soon-to-be decision. And then I go, okay, now give it back. Now give it back. And I allow my little left hemisphere to release the details it just processed back to the right hemisphere into the ambiguity again. And that almost instantly you can become more present with your environment. And you're like, wow, here I am. I gave it back. And I remember that thing I processed plenty well enough. And now it's tying back into what's really happening and what that means inside of the larger picture. And then that causes these other little moments to occur, where then you can zoom back into those moments, but then you give it back. And so whenever you start to worry, it's a sign in general that your left hemisphere doesn't want to give it back because of trust. And so you go, okay, honey, now give it back. Now give it back. And then it's clinging onto it, and it's like, no, I'll hold it. I'll hold it. You're like, you're going to take it apart, put it back in all the spots. And it's like, yeah, but I'll put it back in those drawers, and we'll know where those drawers are, and we can put it back together again, you know? And it's incredible how true that is. Something getting taken apart and getting put back together, and you can feel the anxiety of taking your Legos apart and putting them back, and then saying you can build it back again. You're like, no, it won't be the same. You're like, no, it won't be the same. It'll be different. It'll be better because you're better, because you learned from what you just made. And you're like, that's a lot of surrender. But it's important for us to have that mobility in order to have healthy minds, and because we get so scared and don't trust, we don't want to let go. We don't want to take our little Lego tower apart and put it back in the drawer, because we don't really, our little left hemisphere doesn't realize that our right hemisphere is developing and growing and becoming more wise and more existentially integrated, which means that it's connected to the wisdom of how things work, and it means that it's going to do a better job putting it together next time. And unless you let go, it's going to take a lot longer, because you're going to need to find other Legos because you're storing up all that memorabilia. And that's why it's like, it's so important, like when you become like a hoarder, you're like, man, you are slowing your life down. Like, liquidate so that way you could rebuild again with what you have. And generally that just looks like acknowledging God in all your ways, which becomes a guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the issues of life. And now you're guarding the ambiguous large qualities of your heart, and allowing yourself to choose which things you take apart based off of that priority, and not resisting based off of the left hemisphere's fear. Because remember, the left hemisphere can't see what the right hemisphere knows, what the right hemisphere yāḍaʿs. The left hemisphere can't vision what the right hemisphere kenins. The left hemisphere can't bînâ what the right hemisphere yāḍaʔs. It surpasses its understanding. That you know the love of Christ. That you would know the love of Christ. That you would know by experience the love of Christ. What goes beyond comprehension, that you can't wrap your head around. You can't apply it back to a grid. It's the humility before an incomprehensible vastness that is the beginning of wisdom. It's the fear of the Lord that is the beginning of wisdom. And so that's cool, isn't it? That's cool. And so that's been my whole little process of reintegration. Now give it back. Now give it back. Good job. Good job. And I'm like, whoa, that's right. I have been living my whole life on faith anyway, and I have been really satisfied with this life, and I'm making really good decisions based off of it. I understand what I believe more than a lot of people, and I can articulate it. Like, wow, I might have some good usefulness here to at least make a positive mark before I die, and maybe I'll be able to communicate to my kids how to know this stuff sooner than I knew it, so that way they could go even farther. And my goodness, what a virtuous cycle I find myself within. But you don't see that when you're locked into that fear mode, you know? When you're that overemphasis on self-focus and control and trying to, you know, keep everything oversimplified inside of your own understanding. It's like, no, now give it back. And what's so awesome about that process of reintegration, it's literally the same word. So I'm talking about a neurological process of reintegration, but there's also a sociological process of reintegration that, or a trauma processing step of reintegration that goes, I'm having a trauma response, I'm triggered, I'm unstable. The first step is stabilization. The second step is trauma processing from that place of stability. The third step is reintegration, which is actually having positive experiences within that side again. But yet, it still has to do with your experience within your heart, more so than your experience of reality, the same way your trauma did. The trauma was based off of what you thought was happening, which is why when you're triggered, you can actually get more triggers because everything is hyper elevated. It's like if your trigger takes you back into Vietnam, your brain is actually capable of having more Vietnam level triggers because it's in that place again, even though you're not having that experience again. That physical experience, you're having it inside of your heart. It's so incredible. But yeah, guard your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the issues of life. And as we do, it positions us to actually be existentially oriented and be more synced up with reality and really just grow. And so but ultimately to heal in this particular light, to heal, right? Because we want to heal. You can't rush your healing, right? But you can stop, you can actually begin to stabilize so you're not receiving more wounds, right? And so you can create an environment that is optimal for healing, even if you don't rush it. And that's the difference of leaving the war zone and going into a garden. Even if you can't rush your healing, you can still create an environment that is more optimized for healing. And it's so cool too, because if you really think about it, when you have that trigger event, it upregulates your whole limbic system, and it brings you into a sympathetic nervous system, and your right hemisphere activity drops and plummets, and your left hemisphere activity skyrockets and accelerates with a hyperactive limbic system. But when you put a PTSD soldier into a garden where there's a bird song echoing throughout a spatial environment inside of a place where things are stable, that stability and that spatial reality begins to increase their right hemispheric activity because of the atmosphere that they're inside. And that atmospheric processing, increasing your right hemisphere's activity, as your right hemisphere activity increases, it naturally downregulates your limbic system and pulls you out of that triggered environment where you were creating more wounds and damage. Isn't that wild? And so now you're not rushing your healing, but you're in a spot where you're not getting hurt continually more by creating more trauma responses due to your elevated and exaggerated interaction with your experience with reality. That's why fear is so dangerous, because it starts off seeming reasonable, but it explodes into this place where you're able to be continually hurt without there even needing to be anything there to hurt you. And it's exactly what's going on inside of this country that's not presently at war. Yet people are buying guns, and people are making bunkers, and people are so scared of it all exploding. Yet there's the opportunity to rest, to think, to give it back, and think, okay, what do I believe? Okay, this person in front of me, are they actually, the devil? No. They're actually fairly relatable. Can I empathize with them a little bit? I don't want to, but yes, I can. I can begin to yāḍaʿ them instead of bînâ them. And And as I do, my limbic system downregulates. I enter into a more rational and fully, rational is actually the wrong word, it's just what we use, but we enter into a more stable and accurate association with that moment, and that enables us to make wise decisions that carry that situation out of a cycle of oversimplification into a new progression. Based off of experiential wisdom and the building of experience upon experience, of precept upon precept, wise building. It's as simple as Sudoku. Once you fill in a number that wasn't there, you can build off of it. If it was supported by the numbers that were there, you could know that number ought to be there. And because that number should be there, because those numbers, you build on it, and now you can build and build and build until the whole puzzle's solved. The exact same virtuous process of discovery. But if you negate the process, the puzzle's unsolvable. You can't do it in one step. You have to build. And we will build. And we are building. We just need to breathe. Give it back. Live. Context is already that we're alive. It's a pretty good thing what living things do. Sometimes it seems wild and erratic and out of control, but in reality, it's pretty cool how a desert can become a garden when life is introduced into it. All right. Peace. Amen. Shalom, shalom.